Hello everybody and welcome to the June Northwest Business Breakfast with the Alliance Manchester Business School. I'm Andy Gill, I'm Head of Consulting at Brave, People and Organisation Development. We work with Manchester Business School over about 35 years or so, working with the MBA population generally, helping them become more reflective leaders. So I'm here this morning to talk about getting the best out of people, whether that's in a crisis situation at the moment or beyond that. I think some of the same conditions produce getting the best out of people in either of those contexts. I'm going to cut to a few slides here and there. I'm going to ask a few questions and I'll tell you about a language that may be unfamiliar to you. There's been a great deal of interest over centuries in what motivates people to give it their best, whether that's Roman troops thinking about getting the best from somebody from deep on the edges of the empire, whether it's businesses trying to maximize the productivity of their investment in people. That idea of how do we get the best out of people has been huge. Some of the research that I'm going to share with you is based on work that was done at Harvard during the late 1960s through the 70s and so on. I'll give you a couple of references at the end of the talk. I'm hoping this is quite accessible and doesn't come across as any kind of psychobabble. I found it very useful in my work with organisations, being able to hone in on what conditions are we trying to create that are likely to produce the best result in terms of people's motivation. All right, let's just have a look at a couple of bits of information. Okay, if we just have a look at this header slide, clearly an organisation has pressures to change, whether that's to do with competing in the marketplace, other stuff that's going on financially. It could be new opportunities that appear, or a change in legislation, change of expectation as the workforce moves on, whatever. You can more or less categorize three sorts of change that need to take place. Adapting in terms of product, strategic plans, coordinating activity, and measuring outcomes in some way. Hard performance measures, and where we're going to focus our attention is in that organisational climate down on the bottom right of this diagram. A whole lot of change research has happened, and you'll be pretty familiar with the idea that most change initiatives don't work. They don't produce the changes that were sought. And it seems as though where change did fail, there was an emphasis placed on the top route, if you like, in the model. So the structural stuff and the hard performance measures. That's what was paid attention to dominantly. Where change succeeded, there was much more of a balance across how things were being done, the sort of behaviour and styles that were encouraged, fostered, and for that matter, moved away from, and the organisational climate that surrounded people. So that's what I want to talk about in relation to getting the best out of people. If you wanted a definition of this idea of climate, it'd be something about the atmosphere of the workplace that had an influence on how people worked. And I suppose you could easily say, well, hold on a minute, surely we're talking about culture here. And no, I don't think we are. We're talking about a subset of culture. We're not talking about the enormity of culture. We're talking about something that is much faster to change, that is easier to get handles on, and that does count in terms of people's willingness to give of their best. I think this is a great bit of language. It's what it feels like to work here right now. So what do I mean by that? Feels like it's in the eye of the beholder. It's no good me thinking it's a certain way as a manager or leader in an organisation if that isn't the way that the people that I'm trying to inspire feel about the situation. It's about working here, not here necessarily across an organisation, not even across a plant or an office. It's about work here in relation to who leads me, who I work with most closely, the kind of small group that I might be part of. And lastly, it's right now. It's not something that is immovable and unchangeable. I guess a lot of us used to, in the previous world, spend quite a lot of our time traveling and perhaps staying in different hotels. And I remember an experience where I stayed in a hotel maybe twice in 3 weeks, but in that 3 weeks, it had undergone some sort of change of ownership, which I wasn't really aware of. When I entered reception the second time I visited the hotel, something felt different. I was treated in a slightly different way. It was hard to put my finger on that. But the following morning, I asked at reception, said, "Yeah, what's kind of different here?" Said, "Oh, we've had a new owner, and they're very present, very very hands-on." And had a short conversation, and that was it. That was it. That was the difference that I was perceiving. It was very quick, a matter of a couple of weeks. All right. Ricardo Samler had this to say. So this is the pivot, really, of climate. Are we looking to get grudging compliance in the people who work with us? Or are we looking for their enterprising participation? And I think the idea of climate gives us a language, a way of understanding what levers we might want to pay attention to and how we can affect them. I've got to introduce a bit of a buzzword, I'm afraid, which is this discretionary effort idea. So it's obvious what it means, really. It's the extent to which people are prepared to go more than just the baseline, the difference between just getting by and putting the oil in the machine, giving that extra. And from a number of sources now, including the McLeod report, the engagement report that came out a few years ago, and this work that was done, as I say, in the 1970s, it looks like there's a really significant impact on people's discretionary effort from the climate that they perceive, as much as plus or minus 20%, however you measure that. The model that we're looking at talks about having 6 key dimensions in this thing that comes together as climate. They all have an impact on discretionary effort, and they're strongly influenced by the leadership behaviours that we adopt in the workplace. They're not controlled by those leadership styles necessarily, but in the end, they're the only tool we've got to affect this stuff. I'd like to break down each of these key dimensions so we have an understanding of the language that we're using, really. And in many cases, it's not the obvious first thing that you think of when you see the word. So bear with me and we'll just whiz through each of these dimensions in turn. So firstly, flexibility. Flexibility is about, do I think there's stuff that's unnecessary bureaucracy that hinders me in my job? And do I think that new ideas are easy to get accepted? If I think the present situation is more or less how it should be, I'll be more likely to offer my discretionary effort. If I feel there's a large gap between what I see as the present situation and what it should be, then I'll be less likely to offer that discretionary effort. I used to work quite a lot in the nuclear industry. I didn't have a background in that industry particularly. So when I began that work, I was struck by how much bureaucracy, thank goodness really, but how much bureaucracy, form filling, record keeping, and so on was present in almost everybody's daily lives. And I was quite pleased that I didn't operate in that environment, because I would have found that I would have seen a lot of that as unnecessary and getting in the way. Well, fortunately, I didn't end up in a career in the nuclear industry. And when we did do some research around what do people feel about this, it was never a problem in terms of seeing it as unnecessary rules, procedures that got in the way. Of course not, because in that context, people were educated and brought to understand the necessity for those rules and procedures. Again, just illustrating that it's about the eye of the beholder rather than anything that's absolute. So the first of the dimensions, flexibility. The second dimension, responsibility. This is about how much do I think I can get on with it? How much can I get on with it without having to continually check back with my team leader, my first line manager, whoever it is? And do I feel that I'm accountable for the outcome that I produce. The standards dimension doesn't just mean there are high standards. Again, it's in the eye of the beholder. So, do I feel that the senior team is serious? Serious about improving performance? Serious about me doing my best? Do I see, hear and feel evidence that that's the case? And that evidence might well be that challenging but attainable goals are being set for myself and for others. And a really important part of this, do I perceive that mediocrity isn't tolerated? It's not put up with. It's not blind-eyed. I remember before I went into my education, I spent several months working in a cotton mill in Lancashire. The mill engineer occupies a very powerful position in cotton mills, as I found out. The particular position this mill engineer enjoyed was generally horizontal between a pile of cardboard boxes where he couldn't be seen, though everybody, including senior management, knew that he occupied that horizontal position for much of the day, but nobody would address it. It was blind-eyed, it was too difficult to do. You imagine the impact on a young person like myself and some of my colleagues to know that was going on. What's the point of us trying hard? What's the point of us trying to achieve anything when that's happening? So that's the standards dimension. The rewards dimension. It's easy to see this as something that's to do with remuneration and benefits. And, you know, I guess that has to be part of this, but that's not what it is. Those are tools that we use to recognize, really, aren't they? So the important thing about rewards is that I feel that my recognition is linked to my performance rather than just some blanket of, you've all done very well and there'll be free pizza tomorrow night or whatever that is. Much more that when you made that contribution during the presentation, I really valued that. So it's quite specific. And that people know where they stand, that they can understand an honest appreciation of where they stand in terms of their performance. If people feel those two things are in place, they're likely to be able to offer their best more consistently. Okay, this last but one dimension, clarity. This is about, do I think that I and my colleagues understand the big picture? Do I know what's expected of them right now in their job? And importantly, do I understand how those two things connect? How do those expectations connect to the bigger goals of the organisation? There's an apocryphal story, I hope it's true, I'm not sure it is, which illustrates the point, I think. So if you imagine sometime, I guess it would be in the late 1960s probably, on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and a group of visiting military VIPs are being shown a big facility, a big hangar facility down there. And in the corner of this hangar is someone wearing an overall and brushing bits of aluminium dust and swarf up into a dustpan. And I think the story goes that one of these important high-ranking military people decided to illustrate his connection with the common man and went across to the person doing the sweeping up and asked him what he was doing. And the person fixed him with a gaze and said, "Me? I'm helping put someone on the moon." So, simple example, really. What's the big picture of what I'm trying to do? What am I doing right now? I'm removing swarf that could get into machinery, and the overall goal is I'm part of putting a man on the moon. I hope it's not apocryphal. It might be. So, all right, and this is to some extent where we came in terms of our organisation. Team commitment. This is about, do I believe that people are proud to belong to my work group? Do I believe that people will provide extra effort and won't just turn away when extra effort is needed? And do I know that there's a trust that people are working towards a common objective and not hidden agendas and other things going on? The reason I said this is where we came in is that when I first came across this research was during the manufacturing recession in the 1990s, really, and we were working with various companies in the UK that were having a very tough time, manufacturing companies. And we'd often be asked to work with a team that had perhaps been downsized or changed dramatically. And we'd be asked to do stuff that dealt with rebuilding trust or connection between people. And we'd take that work on and we'd design something that addressed that. We'd run something perhaps down in the Midlands somewhere, and we'd go back into that organisation a few weeks later. And in general, we'd be welcomed, and people would be telling us what a great event they'd attended in Canley or Studley or wherever it was. But we'd go on to ask, and how are things right now? And we'd often get the very depressing result that people said things had actually deteriorated, and they were very disappointed by where the organisation was at the time. Quite depressing to work in that environment. And in some ways, this research helped me, because all these things are not of similar chronology, if you like. So you can't start with team commitment and expect to get very far if there are big gaps that people feel on the other dimensions. If people don't have a sense of, yes, I have clarity. If people don't believe that mediocrity is somehow addressed, you're not going to just build the team commitment aspect in a vacuum. Understanding that has led us and me to, I think, have a greater understanding of how we can design programs and help clients and organizations build something durable, rather than do something that kind of falls into the sand a few weeks after the conversations take place. So there is a bit of a hierarchy here. And it looks like if there are felt gaps, your best approach is to almost work down the hierarchy. That in terms of discretionary effort, the two things that are way out there in front is getting the clarity to a stage where people believe it's acceptable and desirable. Getting standards, and remember that bit about standards, it's not about just high standards, it's about people believing the senior team is putting an emphasis on improving performance. So it's about setting goals, about setting targets. It's also very, very much about not tolerating mediocrity, addressing it in some way. I'm not talking about building a stocks at the factory gates and having some ripe fruit, but I am talking about making sure that people believe if somebody's underperforming, they're helped, they're supported to perform. So going down the hierarchy, as you'll see, team commitment is right at the bottom and is built really on the other aspects of particularly clarity and standards. So how do we put this to work? I'd like to offer you a chance to do some personal reflection. You have the benefit on a video on YouTube, of course, of just skipping this bit if you wish, and as you wish. But what my suggestion is at the moment is you just take a few moments and you identify a distinct work group in your own organisation. It might be your own group of direct reports. It might be the department you work in. It could be some other part. But it is a distinct and discrete subset. It's not your whole organisation. And you do a sort of thought experiment of putting yourself in the shoes of one or two people in that group and thinking through the experience that they will have had in the last few months at work. Now, clearly, that is going to be very different from the experience that they might have had 6 months ago. So climb inside their shoes for a moment or two and just think back to those climate dimensions and the different elements in there, rather than just the headline single word title, and speculate on where might the person or a couple of people you're thinking about perceive significant gaps. And just make a note of that for a little while, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, I hope your reflections were interesting to you, and let's put them to some use now. Having climbed inside the shoes of that individual or a couple of people, now have a think about the sort of leadership behaviours and leadership messages and so on. But behaviours is what we're talking about, the way that somebody acts as a leader, what they do, what they say. What could be done now in the next week to close those gaps? And how could you validate what your own speculation is? So if you've chosen your own direct report group, you'll be pretty close to that, I guess, and you're probably in a position to make some of those changes if you wish. If it's another part of your organisation, then this is a little bit more theoretical for you, I understand. But we're trying to link up our choices of leadership behaviour with the way that those dimensions can be spread, made wider, or closed and get a closer fit. As I mentioned earlier, leadership behaviour is not the only factor here, but it's said to be 60 to 70% is accounted for by leadership behaviour. So it's a pretty significant lever, and it's starting to go for purposeful leadership rather than I do what I do what I've always done, I do what I think the role requires. Well, the role of getting the job done is changing, and unless you're taking the people with you at the moment, then who knows what life's going to look like in the next few months and years in organisations. All right, thanks very much for listening. There are 2 or 3 sources that you may be interested in following up. A lot of the ideas here are contained in a book called The New Leaders. It's coming from the same sort of team that developed emotional intelligence and so on. So as you'll see, Daniel Gorman, Richard Bartz, Annie McKee. That's still in paperback. You'll find it obviously on Amazon or at booksellers. The other 2 are YouTube clips, and I think they're short. They're very much in a different context. I won't tell you too much about them, but they're worthwhile in terms of having a kind of different perspective and a bit of triangulation on these ideas. So the David Marquet video is around the context of a nuclear submarine and the leadership of a nuclear submarine. So it's a bit of a kind of, in some ways, stretched context, but I think it's got a lot to offer. And Dan Pink is offering some research on what really gets to motivate people, which I think fits into this idea of climate quite well. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on another occasion. Thank you.